Right. We are on recording mode, and today's discussion is part of the background lectures on the Enlightenment. And we'll be discussing Enlightenment political theory today, already having talked about Enlightenment and philosophy and the major shifts that took place during the period of the Enlightenment. Now, if you divide the Enlightenment into more or less three parts, then you will have within the political thought of the Enlightenment significant movement across the period 1660 to approximately 1789. And the importance of political thought can be gauged by the fact that we have three distinct revolutions taking place within a span of approximately 100 years. Three distinct revolutions. The Glorious Revolution, which took place in 1688. The American Revolution, which took place 1775 to 83. And the French Revolution, which takes place between 1789 and its lingering after effects go on after that. So what was it exactly that fomented such monumental political shifts? And what were the broad directions in which political theory moved? These are some of the questions that this discussion seeks to answer. Now, there are two things which I want you to remember. One is that for the first time, really, political theory and political thought is treated through the prism of logic and science. So you can say that this is the period when, interestingly, you have the birth of political science. So politics as a science. Now you can say, of course, Aristotle and the others would have initiated that already, but to apply logical thinking, to apply it as a coherent body of rational thought is something that is brought into political science during the Enlightenment one. And secondly, there is a massive opening up, light as opening up in terms of liberty and equality. Liberty, equality, and rights. These are the three key words that Enlightenment political thought would be interested in. And there's also associated with that would be the science of human nature. So what is human nature like? And therefore, what is human government going to be like? And what are the functions of that government? What are the limits of that government? Are questions that the Enlightenment will seek to answer. Now, within this, the first theorist that I'm going to talk about is going to be Thomas Hobbes, whose Leviathan was published in 1651. You, of course, have Leviathan as a separate series of lectures on the YouTube page, which you can go to. But I'll just briefly summarize what Hobbes is saying. Hobbes is suggesting that human nature, in a state of nature, all men are more or less born equal, that all of them have the same finite resources, and that therefore there is intense competition for these resources, for glory, and therefore this state of nature is a state of continuous and relentless war. As a result of this, there is no peace and there is no harmony within the Commonwealth. Everybody is in a state of natural enmity with the other. And therefore, there is an utter chaos which reigns, whereby human nature, as Hobbes very famously said, is nasty, brutish, and short. Human existence itself is seen as something which is in a state of perpetual crisis. Therefore, what is Hobbes's? So this is the state of nature. Therefore, Hobbes asks, what is going to be the nature of the state? Right? And Hobbes says that there should be a sovereign to whom all of us will give his or her own right, part of his or her own right. So if you look at the picture of the Commonwealth, and I urge you to go to that PowerPoint presentation and take a look at it, you will find that this monstrous leviathan, this body of the state, is built with numerous small, heads of people. So people are the one who build up the state, but build up a monstrous sovereign who has enormous power and who cannot be questioned, right? So even if the sovereign is wrong, you cannot depose the sovereign. So the sovereign's power is absolute. He has the power to frame laws, he has the power to choose his counselors, and you are bound to follow the sovereign. Hobbes was, of course, writing in 1651 in the context of the Civil War. Therefore, you can understand some of his anxieties. But Hobbes's state of or nature of the state is therefore the absolutist state, almost bordering on the fascist, right? Now, while you can ponder on Hobbes, but remember that Hobbes's Leviathan is the first really major English political tract that you have, and Hobbes is therefore known as the father of political science. Hobbes is the first to take away politics from religion, right? He says, the state of nature is a secular state, and therefore religion does not matter here. And therefore, the nature of the state is also going to be a secular state, right? And therefore, you have what is called the social contract theory, whereby, the state is filled or fulfilled through the contract between the individual citizen and the state in general. Now, this social contract is going to be the basis of all Enlightenment political thought in different forms, be it in Locke or be it in Rousseau, right? Therefore, it is Hobbes who first secularizes political science, provides it with a strong scientific basis, and, it's A equal to B, therefore B equal to C, therefore C equal to D, and this goes on, this logical sequencing. And therefore, Hobbes has a very clear idea of what the nature of the state is, even if it is fascist, and he is providing for the Enlightenment the impetus towards the social contract theory. So this is Hobbes, this is 1651, right? We are not yet at the initiation of the Glorious Revolution. We are still very much within the English Civil War, right? Now, the man who revolutionizes political science really is the philosopher whom we studied in the last class, and that is Locke. But before I come to Locke, I'd just like to briefly mention Spinoza. Now, Spinoza's Ethics that you've already seen, published 1677, sees no distinction between God and nature, and sees a monistic God as the most supreme authority, right? But this existence of this providential law-giving God sort of creates a rationalist naturalism, which is against superstition or dogmatic religion. Therefore, Spinoza gives to the Enlightenment a kind of thrust, I would say, which moves it towards, once again, a secular basis, a freedom from dogmatism, and therefore a kind of a qualified democracy. Now, I will not linger upon Spinoza that much, because Spinoza is not so important in the very clear-cut political implications of the thought process of the age. But I'll come to Locke's second treatise of government. This was also published in 1690. Now, the first treatise of government was published in 1680, and it was primarily written against Filmer's Patriarcha, a text which argued that the right of the king was absolute. So Hobbes was questioning the absolute right of the king. Now, Hobbes takes this thesis of rationality. In fact, Hobbes has a number of texts which will have a bearing on our discussion. But I'd like to begin with his second treatise of government, which is 1690. And Hobbes talks about, I'm sorry, please excuse me, Locke talks about, once again, the same question that Hobbes was asking: what is the state of nature? And Hobbes and Locke also agrees with Hobbes, is that the state of nature is a state of equality, that all of us are naturally born equal, right? So he says we exist in a state of equality wherein all the power and jurisdiction is reciprocal. I'm quoting Locke here: no one having more than another. This is point number one, equality. This buzzword of the Enlightenment, if you remember, leading to the French Revolution. Second thing that he suggests is that we are all born in a state of natural freedom, right? And that the law of nature, I quote, teaches all mankind that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions, right? Therefore, instead of suggesting, as Hobbes did, that because we are all equal, we will always be in a state of warfare, Locke suggests, because we are equal and rational, we shall always be in a state of harmony with each other. Therefore, Locke suggests that rationality, please excuse me for a moment, rationality dictates that we grant each other freedom, and we have a law of social contract. And therefore, he suggests that we will all agree, because we are rational, we are equal, and we are all free, to have a set of laws that will ensure that we have equal rights and that our properties are secured. Please remember this. What is the difference between Locke and Hobbes? Hobbes is arguing we are in a state of nature which is equal, finite resources, therefore we are always fighting, and our state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short, so we need a very strong sovereign. And that we must surrender our rights, and he is an absolute state. Locke is suggesting we are equal, we are all free, we are all rational. Because we are all free, we are rational, we recognize that we need to surrender some of our rights and choose a sovereign. But what is the classical difference here? Locke suggests that because the sovereign is here, the state is there to fulfill our rational demands, because we have voluntarily given them by contract some of our rights, so that it can preserve our peace and give us equality. If the state violates this principle, if the monarch or the sovereign violates this principle, then we are free to depose the monarch or the sovereign. That is to say, we will elect democratically, we will surrender our right voluntarily, but only and only for the greater good. And if that is not done, then we have the right to depose the monarch, come what may. This is basically what Locke is arguing. And he says that there are three rights that every man has: the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to property. Very important. Right to life, right to liberty, and right to property. Now, very interestingly, Locke is also writing in 1689 another treatise called a Letter Concerning Toleration. And this is about religious toleration, where Locke argues that absolute liberty, and I'm quoting Locke, just and true liberty, equal and impartial liberty is the thing we stand in need of. I repeat, absolute liberty, just and true liberty, equal and impartial liberty. See, what Locke is initiating is a very important debate on the nature of human right and the absolute validity of human liberty. Freedom becomes one of the most important hallmarks of 18th century thought. And therefore, if we require this, then we have to have a toleration towards religion. So we have to have absolute tolerance regarding all forms of religion. Of course, Locke does not talk so much about Catholicism because it has a different monarch outside, but he's basically talking about toleration for all dissenting sects. This is another very important idea that the Enlightenment will bring to the table. Now, it's interesting that in 1693, Locke writes another treatise. This is equally vital. And this is about education. He writes a treatise called Some Thoughts Concerning Education, 1693. So you see, between 1689 and 1693, Locke is prolifically writing not only philosophy, essay of human understanding, we've seen, but an essay of government. He's writing essay on toleration. He's also written something on education, which becomes the basis of modern education. And he says that education should provide for virtuous, useful, and able men. Virtuous, useful, and able men. And he says that the basis of education is that we are intrinsically free, and that we must produce, therefore, through our education, intrinsically free-thinking individuals. And that the basis of education should not be received knowledge, but should be only knowledge that is rationally verified, that will teach toleration, and that will teach us liberty and equality. You see, Locke is therefore that philosopher, that thinker, who is altering the way in which philosophy and philosophy and politics are being reconfigured. And not only philosophy and politics, but Locke has another very important treatise, which is about property. And Locke suggests that property, individuals, because they have their sovereignty over their own self. This is the first and major idea of Locke, that we have sovereignty and freedom over our own self. Therefore, we are born free. And therefore, if we add our labor to what we have, then that property is inalienable. So the right to property, according to Locke, precedes the state. Look at this. This is very important. That the right to property is unalienable, just as the right to myself is unalienable. And if I add my labor to what I have inherited, because we have been born equal, therefore, the right to property is absolute, and it even precedes the state. The state is therefore there to ensure the right to property, right? The security and safety of property. Therefore, I go back to the three rights that Locke is talking about: the right to life and self, the right to liberty and freedom, and the right to property, which is inalienable, right? You cannot alienate the right to property from the right of the self. Locke also suggests that there are two rights. One is the natural law, and the other is the political law. But because the right to self, life, and property is natural law, therefore, civil law will always have to follow it. The law of nature, Hobbes says, stands as an eternal rule for all men, right? So this is one of the most important philosophers of the period who has linked philosophy, politics, religion, and economics, if you consider property as part of economic thought. Therefore, the entire basis is that we have absolute sovereignty over the self, we have equality, we have the liberty, and therefore the right to property, the right to life, and the right to liberty. And also the right to tolerance, the right to free thinking. Locke is actually opening up everything to the concept of equality and liberty. It's funny, isn't it, that the man who, unlocks the human mind as well as thought, political thought, is John Locke, right? It's almost ironic, isn't it? Right. Now, let me then move towards the other major theorist that is, now Locke's treatise, of course, I've talked about Locke's rightful ownership, and that we mix our labor, and this is something which also Adam Smith will talk about when he talks about the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. But that is something which I'll leave for my next discussion, really. Now, before I come to this idea about Rousseau, let me briefly talk about an intermediate philosopher who's also very important in terms of political and legal jurisprudence, really. This is a man not so much about politics, but also about laws, and that is Montesquieu, right? It's Baron de Montesquieu. The Spirit of the Laws is published in 1748. Spirit of the Laws, published 1748. Now, Montesquieu is important because some of our most important notions about law come from Montesquieu, right? Please remember this, right? The first thing that Montesquieu argues, what are his major arguments? He argues for a constitutional form of government. So the importance of the constitution is something that Montesquieu reiterates. Secondly, he suggests that there must be within government a separation of powers. So there must be, a civilian form of government. There must also be a judicial authority within government. And that these organs, you see, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial forms of the state must all be there and must have a system of checks and balances, right? that they must have a system of checks and balances. So this division within the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, and the system of checks and balances is a thesis that Montesquieu forwards. And you see, look at our constitution. Haven't we accepted this separation of powers and the system of checks and balances? So when you're looking at modern political science, what you studied as civics in your class 10 days, and which you, if you've taken your subsidiary as political science, you're studying as a science. How does the state operate? What are the forms of government? What are rights? Are all thoughts which, are fructifying during the Enlightenment. Now, Montesquieu also makes another very interesting point. He says that laws are also geographical in nature. So he suggests that for specific geographies, states, and cultures, laws can change, right? Laws, there's nothing called a universal law, which is all for everybody. I mean, say there might be universal principles in ethics, but law, which is written constitutional document, the Indian legal penal code, as it were, the IPC, which is laid down, can change from one society to another. Say, for example, the Hindu property rights and the Muslim property rights might be different. The rights of a particular citizen in India and in Saudi Arabia may be different given their geographical locations and cultural differences. So Montesquieu is therefore arguing for a legal jurisprudential system which is based on local and specific geographical factors. So what we are looking at is a kind of rehauling or overhauling of the entire system of politics, political science, as well as, of course, the judicial system. Now, in between, we, of course, have the Charter of Rights, and we equally have the American movement for independence. And you see, the Independence Charter specifically talks about the equality of all human beings, right? America is seen as that utopia where there is complete and total, declaration of equality, right? And if you think that, if you read the conclusion to the Declaration of Independence, they talk about the rectitude of our institutions in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies. So the Declaration of Independence is not a partial declaration. It's democratically taken by all the people of the colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. So freedom is one of the most important ideas that the American War of Independence brings, and this entire demand against any form of repression, any form of the prohibition of public good is what the American Declaration of Independence will talk about. And it therefore also argues that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and the political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is not to be totally dissolved. This is what the Declaration argues, right? And it suggests that, once again, the Declaration of Independence is a charter for freedom on the basis of which the French Revolution will also move. Now, it is with that, therefore, that I'll come to the last major philosopher of Enlightenment political thought, although I will briefly mention a few other names. But the one major philosopher is, of course, the man whom we all know as the great, theorist of social contract, once again, JeanJacques Rousseau. Now, Rousseau takes this idea of the social contract to its extreme logical conclusion and suggests that, the social contract will generate a public will, which will be supreme. Now, in Locke, we still have the right to property as inalienable and before the state. But Rousseau says that right to property can be exclusionary, that it can exclude people. So what is important is democracy. It is the general will of the people, which will then redistribute its resources. So Rousseau is suggesting that we are born free, we are in chains everywhere, and therefore it is necessary for us to enter into a social contract, establish the concept of a general will and a democratic state where all forms of authority are overthrown. And it is this general will which will then reallocate the resources and create a state that is marked by welfare. This is the sum total of what Rousseau suggests. I am quoting him: utterly on the basis of common interest that society ought to be governed. Utterly on the basis of common will that society ought to be governed, the general will tend towards equality. That is Rousseau's first thesis, that general will tend towards equality, and therefore we need absolute freedom. Therefore, Rousseau argues that direct democracy is the only form of government in which freedom can be realized. Human freedom is possible only through governance of the general will, which is the will of the body politic formed through original contract. And therefore, if all the citizens come together to form this general will, then the concept of factionalism will dissolve. Now, of course, the other great theorist who will talk about political freedom and resistance towards any form of government will be Paine, who will talk about the rights of man, the inalienable rights of man, and the nature of any government to curtail these rights. So Paine in the 1790s is arguing for a fierce resistance of any form of government, and therefore a very radical form of subjective freedom. Now, Rousseau is talking about political freedom, political democracy, establishment of the general will, establishment of the social contract, reallocation of resources, and therefore a society that will be equal, free, just, and almost utopian. Paine is arguing for absolute sovereignty of the self, resistance to any force that will curtail it, and therefore resistance to all forms of government. You remember how Paine had been a major inspiration for the Derosians, and how Paine had quickly sold out in Calcutta, which caused great consternation among the British, because the colonial state was also under threat with Paine's ideas. Now, there are two areas where I would say, so we've covered, a vast span of time with these philosophers. We moved through Hobbes in 1651, arguing for a totalitarian state, but establishing political science as free from religion and dogma. We have Locke, who argues that human society is essentially rational and therefore will rationally go into a social contract, and there will be inalienable freedom of rights, of property, and of equality of religion. We have Montesquieu, who will talk about how organized government should be and how there should be always a devolution of powers. And we also have a check system of checks and balances. And we have finally, at the end of the century, JeanJacques Rousseau is talking about the general will, absolute power of democracy, absolute social contract, and therefore total freedom of the self, which is taken to another extreme, extreme of subjective freedom by Tom Paine. Now, I'd just like to quickly add two areas where I think there is a failure of Enlightenment political thought, although there are areas where people have already started working. One is this question about slavery, to which many of the Enlightenment thinkers are very ambiguous about. It would take Abraham Lincoln and his great push. But even then, this idea about slavery and resistance to slavery, as to whether the Enlightenment considered equality to be a more European phenomenon, is something that we need to take a look at. Also, given that there is ruthless oppression within the colonies as well, and as well as the Indian subcontinent. China is another location where China, South America, Africa, where the Enlightenment, the shadows of the Enlightenment are much darker than the light that it really exists. This is one area which we might take up slightly later on in one of our discussions. Although you might agree also that 1834, when slavery is abolished, is not so far off from the French Revolution. So already ideas have started. The ideas of equality of the various kinds of people have already started to circulate, but they do not get greater momentum during the revolution as yet. And the other, as Mary Wollstonecraft would later on suggest, that the domestic sphere, women and their liberty, is an issue that the Enlightenment only sporadically takes up, not really much, although Locke will be arguing to some extent. But it is in general very patronizing, and it will take Mary Wollstonecraft writing in the 1790s to make a plea for women's education, and will argue that unless and until women are given education, you cannot demand the rationality that you expect from them. So these are the two areas where I see Enlightenment political thought has certain contradictions in the way that politics and the state of government, the concept of freedom, the concept of equality is largely one, patriarchal, and two, European, right? So these are two areas where you have a certain degree of discomfort. You also see at the same time you have a thrust towards freedom and a thrust towards imperialism as well. So that is another part where the Enlightenment has its shadows. But let me now, round up before I sort of bring this discussion to a close. You see, one of the things that I talk about is, and I started this discussion with, is the three revolutions. The Glorious Revolution, which gave us, you will remember, the division of power between the king and the state. I have, of course, not talked about Voltaire and his letters on the English nation, which praise England as the seat of liberty, where there is a clear distinction of power between the king and parliament, and parliamentary democracy has already been established. You see, apart from any other state, it is England where the political Enlightenment reaches its zenith. Secondly, it's very important to note that, the Glorious Revolution has also given us the habeas corpus, which ensures that if you are produced before a magistrate, if you are arrested, you have to be produced before a magistrate within 24 hours. I have a body. So once again, the body which is recognized by law and has to be produced before the law is something that the Glorious Revolution gave to us. Very importantly, it prioritized Parliament over the king. So in England, actually, we see the dwindling power of the king. This does not take place in either Germany or Russia or France. It will take another revolution in 1917 to actually bring Tsarist Russia to another level of enlightenment. But this is the first enlightenment that takes place in England, quickly followed in Holland, and the seeds of that revolution gradually disperse. You see, the major philosophers that I've talked about at the beginning of the century or the end of the 17th century are English philosophers, right? And then we quickly move on to the French Enlightenment, and you have the presence of Rousseau, the American theorists like Madison, who all talk about freedom, equality, liberty. And therefore, we have two quick fire revolutions, the American Revolution and then the French Revolution, both of which sort of liberate or create an intense atmosphere of liberty across the continent. So continentally then, we are looking at three things. One is that politics is to be sort of separated from religion and dogma, and that politics is to be looked at in terms of reason, rationality, and that government should assume the rational will of the people and exercise a rational will in itself. So what is going to be the best form of government? What is the state of nature? And how does it impact government? Therefore, you bring science to politics. That's point number one. Point number two is that continentally we see the importance of freedom, equality, and liberty as acknowledged as rights of man, the right to life, property, and the right to liberty and equality, right? This is the second very important point. And the movement towards the state, the nature of the state, the social contract, the idea of what the sovereign is, and the movement away from the powerful sovereign to the notion of the state, which is democratic, right? The general will of the people, and which is based on the individual freedom and the right to change government. You see, it's not just about social contract. It is also about the right. Democracy is not merely about the right to form a government. Democracy, or vote a government, is about the right to change a government if the government does not fulfill the political good of the common people. So those are some of the points that I have talked about. I just go through them once again since I wrote them down. Models of government based on the consent of the governed, articulation of the political ideals, freedom and equality, list of basic individual human rights which are to be respected by the political system, articulation and promotion of toleration of religious diversity, and the concept of political powers and political organization as a scientific discipline. This is what the political movement or the political theory of the Enlightenment moves towards through the major philosophers. It is with that that I bring the discussion, my part of the speaking to a close. Now let me open up to discussion and open up this for discussion, and I'll keeping on recording the interaction so that you can revisit them if you like even afterwards. Right. Thank you very much. Your questions. Was I audible throughout the lecture?
Yes, Amrita.
Right. Okay. If you have any questions, please, you can ask them now, or you can listen to them. I am aware, I'm sorry, I'm packing a lot of things into short lectures, not really very short. I've been speaking for some time, but listen to them carefully when you go back, because these are some of the founding ideas which have gone into the making of your political assumptions as well. You know, the way in which we think about politics as a science, the way in which, you know, you take liberty and equality as almost granted, right? And of course, also keep in mind the areas that the Enlightenment did not touch upon. Right. So if you have questions now, fine. If not, we can take your questions at a later time also. No? No questions? Then
Sir?
shall I bring? Yeah, sure. Go, Yud.
স্যার রুশো আর লকের যে ডিফারেন্সটা ওইটা যদি একটু আরেকবার ইয়ে করতে পারতেন, একটু ভালো করে বুঝিয়ে দিতে পারতেন। জেনারেল উইলের ব্যাপারটা স্যার কি, ওই যেখানটা বুঝলাম না স্যার।
Acha. Is there anybody who does not understand Bangla here at all? No. Fine. Let me just alternate between the two languages. Right. Locke is suggesting that, you know, government is formed out of contract. Locke's step key first, that we are all in a state of equality. 1. 2, we are all free. 3, we are all rational. The state of nature is a state of rationality, and therefore we will not fight. We will rationally determine that we need a social contract whereby we need a government. 4, that government is for the good of the people. If it does not perform or it does not live up to our expectations, it can be changed. 5, our freedom is inalienable of the self, and therefore our property is also, the right to property is inalienable, right? So first comes the right to property, and then comes government. What is the function of the government? The function of the government is to protect this right to property, right? This property of ours. Now, you see, that is where, you know, Locke is also in many ways the first of the great philosophers of capitalism, right? Locke and Adam Smith are the two great philosophers of capitalism, in the sense that, you know, my personal property and my executive right over that property comes even before the state. The state is intended to protect this. But the problem remains, if there is only my personal right to property, then the right to property, of course, is that it is my property and not your property, right? So it creates divisions, and therefore it creates inequalities also, right, in terms of economics. What does Rousseau say? Rousseau says, yes, we are all equal, and therefore our political rights are all equal. Therefore, when we form a government, we will form a government with the mandate of the majority, where everybody will contribute and participate equally, right? And therefore, the majority will be there, which he calls the general will. But then the general will may therefore reassign and realign the property so that, you know, there is a rational distribution. Rousseau is far more utopian than Locke, who is much more, you say, practical. Now, therefore, consider the priority. For Locke, the right to self and property is first, then comes the government. For Rousseau, the general will and the government is first, and then comes the right to property, right? This is the major difference. Both of them are talking about freedom of the self, freedom of the social contract, the right to depose the sovereign. While for one, the right to property and self is more important than the general will or any government, for Rousseau, the general will and the formation of the democratic government and its reassignment of property is more important than individual notions of property. বুঝতে পেরেছো? এখানেই হতে পারে তুমি বলতে পারো that Locke is slightly much more on the conservative side than Rousseau. Rousseau is far more radical, right? If you take a leap between Rousseau to the Russian Revolution, there are certain parameters where you can see similarities. Like Locke is far more a theorist about property, self-food, education, which sort of talks about individual sovereignty and so on and so forth. বোঝা গেছে বৈজয়ন্ত?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you. Right. Any other questions? No? Well then, with your permission, I will therefore stop recording the lecture. It will obviously be